Thank you for giving up your time to be here. Well, you all really important to us. Without your support, any of Fuller's work would be possible. And I think we all in this room, we agree that in order to protect the rainforest and fight the climate crisis, we need to work with indigenous people. And that's exactly what Cool Earth does. We're trying to have an ethical, transparent, and respectful way to work with people living in the rainforest. And also we know how important it is for you to see the impact of your support. So now I'm going to hand over to Matt Proctor, our forest data lead, who will share the impact you are having on rainforest and climate. But first, a few words from Tony Jupiter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and have an opportunity just to share a few brief reflections. I'm a long-serving environmentalist, been working on these subjects in different ways for about 40 years, including now being the chair of Cool Earth, which is a role that I'm delighted to have, having spent so much of my career concerned about the protection of tropical rainforests. And I've actually been working on this for a long time in quite a few different capacities as a scientist, gathering data around the distribution of rare birds that rely on tropical rainforests, through to being a campaigner, working to limit some of the damage being caused by the timber industry. I've been an advisor to businesses, including those with supply chains in tropical commodities, including palm oil and beef and sugar. I've been an advisor with the Prince of Wales's Rainforest Project, where we worked to understand better the ways in which we might find values that could be put on forests in relation to their carbon storage. And I've been an advocate to governments, inviting conversations around how we might have bigger and more effective protected areas for tropical rainforests, including national parks and other things. Having seen all of that, and all of these things are important, I have to say that there's one heading which sits above all of the others in terms of the effectiveness of the action that we can take, and that's about the empowerment of indigenous communities. And I think for quite a long time, we would think about the rainforests as being places of wilderness untouched by human hand. Nothing could be further from the truth, of course. These places are inhabited, and they have been for tens of thousands of years. And we can see in the modern context that the places where the forest is still intact, a very large amount of that is down to the fact that the indigenous people still have control of those areas. And indeed, you can look at maps of the Amazon in Brazil and neighboring countries, and you could see that the big chunks of forest that remain there overlap very strongly with the indigenous reserves. And so at Cool Earth, it's a simple step of logic to say that if we want to slow down, halt, and finally reverse the loss of the tropical rainforests, then probably our single biggest, most cost-effective route to doing that is to empower the indigenous communities who live there. And that's exactly what we've been doing, and we want to do much more of it, of course. We know the model that we have is bringing impact, but actually that impact needs to be far greater, considering the challenge that we still lean into. Now, in terms of how we do this work, I'm now going to hand over to Matt, who's going to give you a little bit more of the methods and approaches we're using and some of the impact that we're achieving. Matt.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Isabel, and thanks, Kate, as well. Just trying to share my screen now. Tony, if you give me a thumbs up if you can see it, as you're the only one I can see. Brilliant. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Proctor. I am the Forest Data Lead at Cool Earth. And today I'm going to be talking about the impact of our Indigenous partners around the world. And this impact is really centered around our mission. And our mission is that we back people who protect rainforest and fight the climate crisis. People, rainforest, and climate. Those are the three pillars that underpin our impact. And it all starts with the people we support. As Tony's already alluded to, despite comprising 6% of the global population, Indigenous peoples care for around 39% of Earth's most intact lands. And thanks to their stewardship, over 90% of these lands remain in good ecological condition. But in a world in which inequalities continue to grow, especially now with the impacts of climate change and the climate crisis being felt by millions on the front line, this stewardship is becoming more and more difficult to sustain without the means to adapt, let alone survive. And that's where we come in. Cool Earth gives direct and no strings funding to support our partners' ability to adapt to a changing climate and be resilient economically so that they can continue to protect rainforest effectively. Since Cool Earth started, we've worked in 7 countries with 11 indigenous nationalities, delivering unconditional resources to 41 communities, with our support reaching over 100,000 people in total. From the Ashaninka Nation in the Ani Valley of central Peru to the Suau communities of southeastern Papua New Guinea, these are the people we back who deliver the rainforest protection and climate mitigation that form the next steps of our organizational mission. The first of which is protecting rainforest. So how do we measure this impact in the specific context of our partnerships? The most basic statistic we can look at is the amount of rainforest our funding has reached. We can do this with relatively simple datasets that use optical imagery from satellites, classifying each pixel, for example, forest, water, or urban area, and that from there, as long as we know the territorial boundaries of the partners we have worked with, we can use these satellite images to calculate the amount of forest they protect. In this example of our Peruvian partnership of Oviri, we classify forest within their territorial boundary. 15 years ago, we were working in central Peru with the Ashaninka community of Cutibireni, whose forest spans 60,000 acres or just under 30,000 hectares. As of today, we've supported communities protecting over 2 million acres all across the tropics and primarily in the 3 largest tropical rainforests in the world, the island of New Guinea, the Amazon, and the Congo Basin. That's an area 263 times greater than central London, is actually almost equivalent to the size of Puerto Rico. Since 2009, the forest we support has increased by a magnitude of 35, and even looking more recently, our funding's reach has tripled in the post-COVID era since 2021. In the past year alone, we have launched 2 new partnerships in Papua New Guinea, doubling the amount of rainforest we support in this vital region, and we've increased our work in Cameroon by adding 20 new villages to our partnership there. Beyond classifying pixels of forest, some satellites take images that are high enough resolution to see individual trees. A dataset combining this high-resolution satellite data and ground truthing estimates that there are around 380 million trees in the forest protected by our partners. And zooming in even further beyond the canopy, the tropical rainforests we support are bastions of biodiversity, supporting countless endangered species. For example, tree kangaroos and bandicoots in Papua New Guinea, chestnut eagles and spider monkeys in the Amazon, pangolins and crocodiles in the Congo Basin, and many, many more key species and endangered species as well. Many of our partners live in designated key biodiversity areas, which are defined by the IUCN as sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. So, we have scaled our efforts over the past 15 years by backing people to protect biodiversity-rich rainforests. And the communities we work with are very effective at living in the rainforest in a low-impact way. So Tony's already mentioned some of the maps that you can see of the Amazon and other areas where a lot of the most intact rainforest is in indigenous lands. But we know that this is the case across the tropics from some really good papers. And one that recently came out by Friends of Cool Earth at the University of Sheffield found that indigenous areas are comparable, even better in some cases, to government protected areas in keeping forest standing, which is an astonishing fact, bearing in mind that government protected areas are much more heavily funded and often have no people living in them. We also observe low deforestation rates in the areas we support, applying the same principles as before by taking land classifications in our partners' territories 20 years apart and comparing the calculations of forest cover over that period. And from this data, we can see that averaged across our partnerships, the area of forest only reduced by 1% between 2000 and 2020. Which represents incredibly low rates of deforestation. For context, the Amazon basin as a whole experienced a 9% reduction in forest in that same time frame. Our funding has enabled communities in Papua New Guinea to continue to reject offers from logging consultants, most recently earlier this month in our newest partnership, Kondu. And our support for Ashaninka communities in central Peru has helped thousands in the region to adapt to the increasing risk and incidence of wildfires in their valley, where they've been able to reduce the number of emergencies by over a half since we started working with them last year. For our partners, Cool Earth support has helped to keep deforestation down through enabling them to adapt to a changing climate and economic landscape. And hopefully we can continue to do this long into the future as these pressures continue to mount. They're not going anywhere. Our partner stewardship of the forest is the key to the third and final aspect of our mission, fighting the climate crisis. In this context, tropical rainforests are important for two reasons, which I'm sure all of you know already. Firstly, a lot of carbon is stored by forests that could contribute to climate change if it were released. According to analysis by Global Forest Watch, tropical forest loss currently accounts for 8% of the world's annual carbon dioxide emissions. In other words, if tropical deforestation were regarded as a country, it would be the third biggest emitter globally, ranking just below the United States and China. So it is vitally important that the remaining carbon is kept in the forests and not emitted through deforestation, not only in terms of climate change, but also for all of the other benefits that forests provide, such as local weather regulation, global water cycles, and a home for so much biodiversity. Secondly, the rainforests fight back against climate change. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of the Earth's carbon sink, that is the removal of carbon from the atmosphere, is attributed to the growth of trees in tropical forests. So how can we measure carbon in our partnerships and their contribution to our mission? Satellites equipped with light scanning or LiDAR provide a different kind of data than optical imagery. They send light waves that bounce off the trees, building a profile of the forest's canopy height and density. Given the height and density of the trees, scientists can then calculate their biomass, which is then combined with other data sets containing soil biomass and how much is stored in the roots of the trees, and converted into carbon. Our current methodology, which has been reviewed by the University of Edinburgh, estimates that the carbon stored in our partners' forests to be 500 million tons. That's almost equivalent to the annual emissions of Russia. But as well as quantity of forest and carbon, we can also look at the quality of the forest carbon on a per hectare basis, also known as carbon density. The rainforests we support are of very high quality in terms of their value as a carbon store. A recent paper analysed brand new carbon data produced by the company Planet this year, harnessing their fleet of low Earth orbit satellites, which provides carbon values at 3 meters resolution, 10 times more detailed than previous satellites have been capable of. The paper has identified the so-called peak carbon areas of the Amazon basin, defined as anything over 140 tons per hectare. It found that the areas of highest value carbon rainforest are located in both the northeast and the southwest of the Amazon. And the southwest of the Amazon is where our partnerships in Peru are located. Applying this new data to our own work, we know that all of our partners in the Amazon live in rainforests that exceed this carbon peak value of 140 tons per hectare. And in the other continents that we work, the carbon density of the trees is even higher, at over 200 tons per hectare. In addition, some of our partnerships are also located in extremely carbon dense soils, such as mangroves in coastal Papua New Guinea and peat swamps in the Congo Basin. And keeping the forest standing is vital to the preservation of the carbon locked in these soils. So we work with some of the most carbon dense rainforests in the world, each hectare storing vital amounts of carbon that our partners continue to protect. And finally, by analysing carbon flux data sets from Global Forest Watch, we can also see that as well as vital stores of carbon, the forests that our partners live in are also carbon sinks, removing carbon from the atmosphere. This means that their forests sequester more carbon through the growth of trees than they emit through degradation or deforestation, which occurs through the use of forests for our partners' livelihoods or through natural events such as landslides and wildfires. So to recap on our key impact indicators, people, forest, and carbon, Cool Earth has backed over 100,000 Indigenous partners around the world who continue to steward 2.1 million acres of forest, which contributes to fighting the climate crisis by storing over 500 million tons of carbon in very biodiverse and carbon-dense rainforest. As I've mentioned throughout this presentation, our partner communities have been living in the rainforest for generations, sometimes thousands of years. It's no surprise that the rainforest in these areas is a sustainable carbon store, one that is vital to keep in place to prevent further climate change. So let's ensure that we keep supporting our partners and continue to scale our impact in the coming years. Thank you for listening, and I think I'll be handing over to our director, Matthew Owen, now for some next steps for the organisation.
Terrific. Thanks, Matt. That was great. As always, very, very clear evidence of impact. And as you can see, we are very rich in data. I've got to say, the numbers, when they're put down so starkly, even surprise me. The fact that after 17 years, we are working alongside 100,000 people to protect 380 million trees really does stagger the whole of the team. And it's entirely down to the support that you've been giving us over the many years. Before we get on to Q&A, and I'm sure we do have quite a few questions for Matt and Tony, I wanted to flag up what our next steps are going to be, because I do think 2024 has been a key year from us in terms of demonstrating just how clear and effective our approach is. Our approach to put direct, unconditional funding into the hands of people who live in rainforest villages, often direct to households, is genuinely unique. No other organisation is doing this. Many give to other NGOs, many give to state organisations, but actually to have a direct relationship between you, the donor, us, and people who live in the rainforest is seen nowhere else in any other organisation. And I think it's beholden to us, because it works so well, because the impact is so high, to really take a step back and figure out how we can scale this going forward, because our partnerships are some of the most durable conservation relations available at the moment. Quite simply, when we started working in Cutebereni 17 years ago, we said we'd be there to help them protect the rainforest long term, and we're still there. We're still there with the Auahun, with the people in Papua New Guinea. So going forward, it is very much our focus to figure out how we can expand those existing relationships, but also add some new partnerships. And in 2025, we'll be adding new partnerships in the Amazon, we hope in Brazil, the Congo, and indeed expanding in Papua New Guinea. This is not because we have funds aplenty, it's because we are getting more and more efficient and agile in putting our approach into action. Alongside that, we have a big job in terms of convincing the world that our approach is working, which is why we've invested so heavily in Matt's team, with 2 new people joining us on the monitoring and the evaluation side. We have so much data going back over 17 years. Turning that into apples to apples examples is critical to persuading policymakers that our approach is not something that might work in some places, but is actually the most effective multi-context approach for saving rainforests. And you're going to be hearing a great deal more in terms of the data that Matt has described, both at the community level, the canopy level, and indeed the landscape level. And then the third thing we have to do, as I said, is convince. I've got to say, Tony Juniper, for those of you who haven't come across him, is probably the most influential conservationist around at the moment. He's worked from everyone from Natural England, which he chairs at the moment, to obviously turning Friends of the Earth into the extraordinary organisation it is today. Along the way, had a little something to do with WWF as well. We are very, very lucky to have Tony, but it's also a huge demonstration of his faith in the model we have. And the fact we also have people like Professor Johan Rockström as our lead ambassador demonstrates that people who have been looking at this issue for decades feel that our approach is the most effective. And using those voices to persuade governments, persuade people with even deeper pockets that they can support Cool Earth to expand this over many more landscapes is without a doubt a priority. And as I said, our advocacy work is something that is going up a gear. More on that over the coming months, but probably we've been speaking enough now. So if I may, I'm going to pass over to Lauren Howard, who leads our fundraising and development, who's going to be in charge of questions and answers.
Thanks, Matthew. That's great. And just to remind everybody, I can see the questions rolling in the Q&A, but if you haven't seen it, if you just go down to the bottom of the screen and hover, you should be able to see the Q&A button, and we can still take some more questions. We've also had some questions in as people have registered for the webinar, so we'll try our best to cover as many as we can. If we don't get to your question, we will definitely pick a selection to follow up with you on email afterwards. But I'm going to kick off. I'm going to roll 2 questions into one for you, Matt. The first one was, how does Cool Earth gather the satellite data? Is it open source? And sort of on that line, what type of data do we get on the ground with the Rainforest Labs that we our donors fund?
Sure. Yeah, so the first question, most of the data we do get from satellites is open source. Yeah, there's an amazing body of published data sets out there from a lot of different academics and universities. A lot of it you can find on Global Forest Watch, that sort of pulls together a lot of amazing different data sets, and also the I think it's called the Resource Hub on the World Resources Institute. We also use some data from the private company Planet, who, as I mentioned in the presentation, have a low Earth orbiting satellite fleet that can take much higher resolution data. We've just started using some of their carbon data to get even more accurate insights of the carbon in our partnerships. And then in terms of on the ground, the whole concept of Rainforest Labs is that project is for us to provide data to our partners rather than for us to collect sort of ground truthing data from our partners. There is a two-way flow of information, but as I mentioned, with the all of this open source data, that's amazing for anyone to access if they just have an internet connection. That data could be so useful to Indigenous people if they just knew how to access it, and they had the internet connection and the infrastructure, the computer infrastructure in order to do that. So what we found with the Rainforest Lab project is that our partners have used that data to do lots of different things, monitoring their territory for external threats, for example, but also to collect their own things that they're interested in themselves. So maybe different species that are culturally relevant to them, so that they can monitor the progress of biodiversity or their medicinally or culturally important plants in their area.
Thanks, Matt. That's great. And a question really that was following up from Matthew from your update. What do we need to be able to roll this model out elsewhere?
That's a very simple answer. Cash. We're an incredibly efficient organisation. We can, for many of our projects, deploy getting on for 90 pence in every pound that's donated directly into the rainforest, and we're focused on growing that throughout our partnerships. That means that if we were to get another £1 million tomorrow, we could pretty much double what we're doing in Papua New Guinea almost overnight. Isabel leads an extraordinary team of people in Papua New Guinea and Peru and elsewhere, and they are in touch with the communities we work with on often weekly basis. Our ability, therefore, to deploy that cash and scale with adjoining village or new ones is pretty much unrivaled in the NGO world, we'd say.
Thanks, Matthew. And a question which I'm going to direct to Tony. So with rainforests continuing to disappear globally, how does Cool Earth's work and efforts stack up against this larger trend? How can we help?
So yeah, a very important observation, Lauren, is the continuing deforestation. And some of the figures are quite terrifying. You know, even in the wake of targets being set internationally, we're still seeing forests being cleared, mostly to make way for agriculture and sometimes with deliberate government backing. And so, you know, there is definitely a need to be working more with national governments to be able to convince them to enact policies and the implementations of such policies to slow this down. And actually, one of the things we will do at Cool Earth are doing is to establish a stronger advocacy function so that we can speak to governments. And certainly I've done a lot of that over the years in terms of my work as a campaigner and a policy advocate. And it can work and it does work. And actually, you know, you can see some really quite transformative examples of how that can create impact when the message lands in a good way. I guess my favorite example is the country of Costa Rica in Central America, which has doubled its forest cover since the 1980s, and which has also at the same time doubled its per capita GDP. And so there are things that national governments can do to turn things into a different direction. I would say, however, that in terms of what Cool Earth is doing, as I intimated at the beginning, you know, the piece which is probably most effective in slowing this down is empowerment of the people who live in the forests and who should and can have control of it. And, you know, we could go to make more of certification schemes. We could do more in terms of advocating for new national parks and what have you. But I think if we wanted the biggest impact, then investing in the kind of work that we're doing at Cool Earth is going to be the way of generating maximum impact in the short term, alongside that lobbying of national governments to put in place more frameworks, including those which create the political empowerment of the indigenous societies that live in those countries. And, you know, at the end of the day, this is all about politics. And, you know, if you look at the way in which the indigenous worldview leads to different outcomes, that is about, you know, the extent to which they have power in the societies where they live and giving them some ability to be able to control their land and participate in the national discussion. That really is a very, very powerful way of creating a positive impact in the face of those other forces pushing in the opposite direction. And I think, you know, just one other thing to add, you know, doing what we've always done is likely to get the same result that we've always had. And so this is why I'm so excited about the work of Cool Earth. It's genuinely innovative, it's entrepreneurial, it's pushing at the very edge of what's been tried before, and it's delivering results. And so I think, you know, for me, it's a model that is working and which deserves more backing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. We had a couple of questions that were submitted before the webinar, so I wanted to answer one of those. How do you plan to attract and engage younger people in 2025? And Max, thanks Max, has also asked, what are the biggest barriers to communicating your message to people and keeping them engaged in your mission? I just wanted to answer this briefly. We have a fantastic audience who are really engaged and hugely advocate for us, but we need more people. You know, we're not the biggest environmental organisation out there, but we have really big expectations for 2025, and so we need to be able to share our message with as many people as possible. We already have a significantly younger audience for our website, so that's our biggest audience, is 18 to 34 years old visiting our website. And we're collaborating with new sectors, things like gaming partnerships. So far, we've raised £250,000 through gaming partnerships, which is really exciting. And we're working with influencers. So you may have noticed this year that we have really increased our presence at events, including COP. And also we've got some amazing team members who are in that age range themselves, and they've just been fantastic at connecting us, talking to people, presenting, going to talks on our behalf. And so we're really excited about building on that in 2025. But I think that the biggest barrier really is volume. We've been doing a lot of PR work as well. Hopefully you've seen us in the Times, the Guardian, the Independent, on the BBC World Service this year. And that really is us stepping up our game and making sure that we're finding more and more people that believe in us and believe in the work that we do. I've now got a question for Matthew. So Alan asks, how is direct payments better than contributing to projects selected and supported by village councils?
Oh, that's a good one. We could do a whole webinar on this, but for the sake of time, the more control the recipient has over the cash, the more power they'll have and the more sensible ideas they'll come up with. For some years, we co-invested in community assets with villages, particularly in Peru. And even though we were incredibly open to many ideas, and we did a great deal of time actually sitting down with the community doing participatory planning, often the ideas that we put forward were the ones that were picked up on and invested. And that was down to a lot of things, not least the huge power asymmetry. If you have a European NGO turning up with a lot of money saying, would you be interested in doing this? Then probably they'll say yes, out of politeness, but also because they just want to get hold of the money and see something happen. So many of these communities have experienced other NGOs who basically turn up, promise the moon on a stick, and then don't do anything. If we actually take a step back and are far more absent from the planning process and actually just leave people to get on with it, then they come up with solutions that actually benefit far more people in the community, have a far greater impact in terms of livelihood and reducing vulnerability. And therefore, we've come to the conclusion that providing direct, unconditional grants, generally to village councils, but also on occasions households and even individuals, is actually a far more cost-effective and conservation effective approach.
Thank you, Matthew. And I guess a related question for you again, how does Cool Earth develop relationships with Indigenous communities in order to then give them the direct financial support? How are we reaching out?
If we were to say we will work with any rainforest community who applies to us, then our inbox would immediately break down for the number of communities that wish to work for us. And without a doubt, it is not difficult to find people who are tremendously engaged in keeping their rainforest standing and actually want some support to do that. Therefore, we have to be quite careful, because if we turned up in an area and just gave the impression that we're looking at feasibility, we raise expectations very high. So what we've tended to do is we were very lucky in some of the early relationships we've had, particularly in central Peru and Milne Bay province in Papua New Guinea. And those partnerships have grown organically. Quite simply, neighbouring villages have seen what's going on, seen the fact that child malnutrition falls, levels of malaria fall, people have more control over their futures and indeed their forest, and want to get involved. So that's generally how we've grown. Going forward, we are now looking at putting in some brand new relationships, but we're being incredibly careful about how we do that. Again, not to raise expectations. So often we do that hand in hand with generally local Indigenous federations, sometimes with anthropologists, but in a way that means that if we are going to start funding an organization, or rather a village or some families, we're able to do that for at a very minimum of 5 years. We take it very seriously that you can't just slip in and out of people's lives. These are not life-changing amounts of money, but they are money that people start to depend on. And as such, when we create a new relationship, a new partnership, we're able to stick with that for many years to come.
Thanks, Matthew. Isabel, did you have any other thoughts on that question?
Sure. I would just add to what Matthew has already said. No, like, it's not an easy work, of course. It takes a lot of time to build the trust with the communities we are working with. So we have been doing this for 17 years, but every community is different, every context is different. And you have to remember these are communities that face a lot of unique challenges by living in the rainforest, no? And they have been approached by other NGOs as well that sometimes have taken advantage of them as well, of their territories or the way of living, or as we said, imposing ideas that doesn't really match, the community's values and culture. So this building trust process takes some time. So as schoolers, what we do is we approach the indigenous organization first, then we go to the community leaders, then we run workshops with women, with men, with youth, with elderly of the community. So we really want all of them to understand Cooler's approach, and that's when we start, running a pilot or a project after. So trying to follow a very ethical, transparent, respectful way in everything that we do.
Thanks, Isabel. I think this question is another one for Isabel. So do direct income payments foster dependence on external sources rather than spurring local income generation?
Oh, sorry, could you repeat the question, Lauren?
Yeah, sure. Do direct income payments, did they increase reliance on external sources and organizations rather than, say, encouraging local income generation?
Yeah, definitely. As we said before, like maybe providing the cash on a direct way is a more effective way to do it, because sometimes the community really spend the money in very unpredictable and surprising ways. No, they know better what are the challenges they're facing. And so we have been surprised at how they've been using the cash in many other ways, not only to support, themselves, their families, their children, but they have also come with ideas on how to keep doing conservation activities, like, for example, droughts and forest fires are a big issue in the communities, and with climate crisis, those issues are becoming more challenging every year, and some communities are investing the money, for example, in reforesting water springs, or using the cash to make a new walling or roofing of the houses, because of the extreme weather conditions that they have to face. So it's really surprise ways how they are using, and the most important is building their resilience. And in those communities, so next time they might face, any illegal economy or any forest fire or climate crisis, they will be more resilient to face those issues.
Thank you, Isabel. I've got another question for Matt, which is, are you training local people to use GPS handsets and map their own land with cultural significant sites?
Yes, in the short answer is yes. As part of the Rainforest Lab project, we supply our partners with GPS devices, but also rugged tablets that can be used in the field. And they collect data on these tablets, and then they come back to the lab and they can view all of the things they've collected. And in terms of what they collect, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of down to them. We encourage them to design the project themselves. So they might be collecting information about the boundary of their territory. In northern Peru, the project we have there, they decided to delineate some of their area as a designated conservation zone. And they would also be collecting information about culturally important species, or some of the big fauna that they might find in their territories. So lots of different ideas depending on the place that we're working with, and depending on their the community's own goals in terms of what they want to get out of the project.
Thank you, Matt. I have time for probably one or two more questions. We've got a couple of others that came in before the webinar as well, and then I'm going to hand back over to Matthew. Someone's asked about whether we're working with other organisations, for example, Direct Giving, Give Directly is another one, to get the money direct to communities before we have a chance to set up more projects. Matthew, is that one that you'd like to take?
Yes, I'd be delighted. We work with some fantastic collaborators from the likes of Cadastre to many Indigenous federations. And of course, we have great links with Give Directly, who are a very similar charity in terms of they also focus on direct, unconditional payments. And we would love to do something with them at some stage in the near future in the Congo Basin. I've got to say, we're going to see more collaboration going forward, though. That's simply for the fact that we have such a great model and it is so well documented in terms of its impact that the opportunities for us are quite overwhelming. And it's only by working with organisations such as those that we'll be able to actually meet the potential that I think we have.
Thanks, Matthew. I've got another question for Isabel, which is, what else are our partners asking us to do? What more are they looking for from Cool Earth?
Well, I think we have here from indigenous organizations in the climate change conference that probably all of you have followed, that they are demanding a fairer redistribution, of the finance. So that's exactly what Cool Earth wants to do. We have seen these more traditional conservation models, like probably they are not only sometimes failing achieving conservation outcomes, but also to ensure a fair distribution of resources. So through, providing direct financial support to Indigenous communities, exactly what we're trying to do, to reach a model that is fair with Indigenous communities, that we can transfer the resources that they need to keep protecting the forest. And that's why we probably in the coming months, we are going to be working more with Indigenous organizations, federations in the ground, community leaders, and as Matthew said, you are exploring also a networking and working with governments and cooperative to keep moving or scaling our model to other rainforest areas in the globe.
Thanks, Isabel. Matthew's going to wrap up. A question that came in before the webinar seems really pertinent, so I'm going to ask you this to hand over. So what are we going to do in 2025?
Oh gosh, okay. That's an exciting one. It's not just more of the same. There will, without a doubt, be a continuation of all our existing partnerships. And I know one of the greatest sources of pride for the team as a whole is the fact that we have tremendously consistent, durable relationships with a whole range of Indigenous communities. But we're also going to be recognising that it's a model that works so well, we need to beat the drum louder. We need to demonstrate that there are even other contexts in terms of other rainforest nations, other landscapes that this works very effectively in. And we need to scale up some of the existing partnerships to demonstrate that if the United Nations Environment Programme actually did wish to funnel some of its many billions into this, it's plausible. It's plausible that they could put this into not just the 100,000 people we work with, but the 10 million people. So it's going to be a really big year, 2025, and building very much on some great successes in 2024. I should make it very clear, this is only possible because we have such an extraordinary range of very loyal supporters. We get no money from governments. We get small bits here and there from some really exciting institutionals, and we have one or two fantastically loyal large foundations. But ultimately, we have 70,000 people who every now and again find some money to give to us. And that is the thing that has kept us going for 17 years. Going into 2025, we are very, very ambitious. And therefore, we do need you to support us going forward as well, I'm afraid. Now is the great time to do it because, as you'll see, we have our campaign, as every charity does at this time of year. We have a genuine match, though. This is not something that's made up to try and get you over the line. We have £400,000 that we can access if we raise £400,000 from you. And £800,000 is genuinely transformative for an organisation of our size. So if you're able to, please do support us in the current end of year campaign, because as I said, we have some extraordinary things to do in 2025. We don't want to take a great deal more of your time up today, and I know that many charities run these sorts of events. We do a few a year. We'll probably do a few more, but we certainly don't want to abuse your time. So if I may, I'd just like to first of all thank Tony and the rest of the panel for making themselves available, but also thank yourselves for your loyal and consistent support for Cool Earth. We're a very small organisation with very big ambitions, and I know with your support, we will fulfill those ambitions. Thank you very much and have a wonderful Christmas.